And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this volume 23 of the Integralist Chronicles. Okay, guys. In this series, as I said to you before, this is my story. This is the story of my life in many ways and the things that I've experienced that's led me to sort of the philosophies of life that I believe in, whether it's politics, culture, religion, what have you, right? And it's been a life of, well, turmoil and suffering, but also great joy and great blessings in many ways. And I try and share those experiences with you in this particular cast. And today, I was having a conversation with a few friends of mine about the institution of marriage in American modern society and some of the contradictions in my mind that we have in some of the problems with marriages. Um, First of all, let me just state for the record my personal belief. I'm doctrinally, dogmatically Catholic on the belief of marriage. And I believe it's a lifelong commitment. I believe that marriages are indissoluble and that they're for a lifetime. That being said, that being said, and here comes the caveat, right? Um, I'm also seeing a culture around me where the faith has fallen apart. I joke around with my friends a lot and say, listen, have the gates of hell prevailed? Have the gates of hell prevailed against our society or culture or church, right? And I don't mean that in a dogmatic sense, right? I don't mean that in a theological sense. I mean, have we passed the point of reason in terms of how we practice our faith, or at least the practicalities around it? I look at the way relationships are formed in this society, and it's completely broken at this point in history, where the liberal culture dominates us and really exacerbates and titillates every fallen nature we have. Don't live in a homogenous Catholic society. Heck, we don't even live in a moderately Protestant society anymore. Um, we're a true bastion of pluralism. We're a true bastion of liberalism. And with that comes the fundamental problems of how we create relationships and ultimately how we govern and judge marriages in the society. And this is strange for me because, as I said to you before, I'm a child of two worlds. My family came from that homogenous Sicilian island where not only was everybody Catholic, but everybody was Sicilian. And if you want to see where marriages truly work, get a culturally, religiously, and ethnicity sort of homogenous society, and that's where you see marriages actually work. Whereas there's standards, there's morals, there's shame and blame, there's common values, common religion, familial alliances, everything that fosters an environment for marriages to work. But in this bastion of liberalism we call America, or the secular liberal West, the institution of marriage has collapsed. If for anything else, pluralism being one of the main culprits. It's funny because I look at my parents' generations and divorce hardly happened. Now, I got to keep this in mind. Both my father's side and my mother's side were all born in Italy, in Sicily. And all of them actually married other Sicilians, which of course they were all Catholic as well too, before they came to America. Some came here, got married, and went back over there for the marriage and then came back. But they fostered, at least my grandparents did, fostered an environment where they made sure their kids would marry other Sicilians who were also Catholic. And for that reason, those marriages, generally speaking, worked. Divorces were almost non-existent. You go back another generation, go deeper into the roots of that sort of Sicilian hegemony. You go to my grandparents' generation, and then, I mean, divorce was almost non-existent, period, the end. And so what we've seen sort of in this timeline of history as Western civilization has rebelled against Christendom, as Western liberalization has adopted, again, these laissez-faire moral principles of the Enlightenment, we've seen the loosening of standards and moral principles leading to the breakdown of marriage. And listen, for me, it's radical because I come from a family of strong marriages on both sides of my family. And yet I'm looking at my generation, first generation born here in the States, and the divorces now are rampant all over the place. They just are. And I would imagine with the next generation, it's only going to get worse. The divorce rate with my kids' generation is only getting, more prolific. Let's put it that way. And you ask yourself, okay, how is all of this supposed to work at the end of the day? Because these abstract ideas of freedom and liberty, listen, they just don't work. All right. I mean, listen, we all champion the ideas of freedom and liberty, and certainly to a certain extent, we all value those principles. But let's be honest, we need social structures in place to help us to conform to a societal standard and a cultural standard that's more, sort of, what do you want to call it, that helps us deal with our fallen nature a little bit more. And so the way we foster relationships now, in the midst of all this moral depravity, all the sex-drenched society, the relative morality, because as Americans, we've never adopted not only social structures, but any two concepts of religious principles, and you throw in all the pluralism, uh, it's been ripe for disaster. Throw in the radical elements of feminism and liberalization, pornography, contraception, which has altered the relationship between men and women, the easy peasy divorce, the proliferation of the homosexual lifestyle, and it's been ripe for disaster. It's been an absolute devastated culture and society that we have fostered for the past 50, 60, 70 years. And really, you could argue since World War II, because something fundamentally changed after World War II. As I said before, we were all told that at the end of World War II, we won. The good guys won, right? We liberated Europe from the tyrannical rule of, the fascist regime, and we won. Freedom won. And yet, when you look around, it sure doesn't feel like we won anything. It doesn't. As cultures and societies of the West have simply fallen off the cliff, morally, culturally, politically, economically, in many ways too. And yet we're told we won. And what's funny is that you have this timeline that pretty much works to a T as the liberal empires of the Protestant Anglo societies rise to prominence, the more moral depravity increases in the liberal West. I mean, we could go back to really the Enlightenment era, the 18th century, and point out the problems that the Anglo-British Empire is already causing and the moral depravity that it's helped spreading. But we'll leave that for another time. Look at what's happened over the past 80 years since the end of World War II. As most historians will tell you, that the end of World War II was the beginning of the American empire. And for that 80 years, we've seen one major correlation. As the American empire has grown in influence, in scope, in size, in degree, Christianity, the old Christian world, Christendom and the principles and the morality of Christendom have fallen along with the American empire. Is that a coincidence? Is it? What is it about America that leads to this continued moral degradation of culture and society? Again, I'm from a different world. My family came from that old world that rejected liberalism until it was forced upon them by bombs during the war. Afterwards, all those Catholic nations were forced to adopt liberalism. But how is this supposed to work at this point in time? How are people supposed to find, understand, build well-ordered relationships? Because they're not. We've unleashed the beast. We've unleashed the kraken of liberalism. Now, in this discussion I had with my friends, there was a little bit of a debate. Whose fault it is at this point that culture and society, and ultimately more directly marriages and families breaking down, whose fault is it? I have some of my Catholic friends who say it's the church's fault. Vatican II and weak prelates that simply won't stand up for the truth of the faith. And I think there's some truth to that. Some truth to that. On the other side, and I think this is the side that I take more of, is it's liberalism. It's liberalization. Especially those platitudes that we as Americans have internalized: freedom, liberty, freedom, liberty, freedom, liberty. Freedom, liberty, of course, in its most abstract forms. I think in general, there's nothing wrong with freedom and liberty within a well-ordered society. But see, that's the issue, is that American freedom and liberty has never been well-ordered. It's always been this loosely laissez-faire idea when it comes to culture and society. And it all begins, as I said so many times before, it begins with the concept of religious liberty, which basically is you get to pick and choose your own personal moral code. And your personal moral code doesn't affect your neighbor. Okay, fine. So how are me and my neighbor supposed to coexist in the same society if we have different moral standards, different religions, believe in different gods, different attributes, different customs, different traditions, different histories? See, that kind of matters in order to have communities that can work together cohesively. Again, I'll go back to the old world where divorces hardly happened. My old Sicilian island, where, at least in those days, I know Italy's liberalized now after the war, I've acknowledged that. But in those days, when everybody was Catholic, everybody was Sicilian, marriages, relationships, they worked. It wasn't a perfect world. No, don't get me wrong. I would never say that. But in terms of religion, culture, society, and how relationships are formed, it did work. It did work. But now we're in the land of freedom, where truth is malleable, where truth is subjective, where truth is in the eye of the beholder. And it's interesting because we've kind of seen how that's played out throughout American history. As I said so many times before, the first and foremost thing you notice about American society is the constant rebellion of the family. A strange kind of rebellion that I just can't figure it out, because even the pagan nations have learned to honor family. It's not just a thing that you see in Italy or Spain or the Philippines or Mexico, where you have deep Catholic roots. Go to Asia. They have deep respect for their families over there. But in America, it's different, right? It's this kiss my ass, mom and dad. You can't tell me what to do. And it's one generation that always rebels against its parents and grandparents. And it's strange because I come from a society where we were learned to honor, respect, love, obey our parents and our grandparents. Not in America. It's a little bit different. Always has been. And this is why you've seen the idea of freedom and liberty, or as I like to say, political rebellion, because that's what we mean by freedom and liberty in America. It's not a true freedom and liberty. It's a political rebellion at the very origins of the nation. And that simply has just transgressed through the family. If you're going to have a constant rebellion at the political level, why don't you think you're going to have one at the familial level? And we see this immediately with the proliferation of religions, really within the first generation, tinkering with the truth of God under the guise of religious liberty, where every man, woman, and child can make up his own moral decree. Every man, woman, and child could be their own pope, so to speak, at some point. And this divides us as a nation. It divides America, American society. It doesn't help us conform. It doesn't help us admire, honor the same standards. Sure, we have some basic standards from the fumes of Christendom that for the first 2 centuries we kind of followed, right? Based on tradition, because the Protestant sects and all that stuff that, came over from the old country, they were bringing some of those traditions over. But as the vapors or the fumes of Christendom sort of, vaporized, went away, we've seen the complete moral degradation of our society and the breakdown of the institution of marriage and family. It's just so strange to me. Because on one hand, I'm strictly doctrinal when it comes to the teachings of marriage on the church. On the other hand, I look around now and I see a bunch of people incapable of forming proper relationships. A society and a culture where people, again, are bombarded with sex and porn and materialism and all the allures of the world. We're purposely kept in government institutions like the educational system longer than we need to be. We put women immediately on pills as soon as they're capable of being, childbearing age. We're handing condoms out to delay what we believe is the inevitable, because we know that the biological, motions of our sexual drive are they're ramping up. And even with all the technology and the contraception, it still hasn't prevented the out of wedlock births, the abortions, and everything that goes wrong in the liberal society. Yeah, I don't know. And so now we have a divorce rate that's absolutely exploded because we don't know how to form these relationships anymore. Family's not in the picture anymore. Familial alliances, they used to play a role in marriages. Faith and religion, well, most people don't even get married in church, I don't think, anymore at this point. It's a big difference when you go before the altar of God and you get down on your knees to make a promise before God and all your families as witnesses, rather than showing up as some justice of the peace. I'm sorry. I think it's a whole different meaning and purpose when you do that. When you believe in the faith and practice the faith and you take that oath in front of God, it means something. It means something. You see the rise of feminism and sort of the hypergamous nature of women, where what is it? Something like 90% of all women now are gravitating toward a top percent of men, leading 90% of men effectively to be alone, most likely addicted to porn and playing video games. That's because the nature of women have changed since they've been put on the pill. Women see relationships different. I believe men are the romantics. Women are the opportunists that surrendered this beautiful biological calling that God gave them to be the gatekeepers of morality. But now that you have women that have been liberated and they're sleeping their way to the top in this hypergamous attempt to feed the insecurity of their reproductive system that they have, women have lost, surrendered control of that ability to keep the sexual drive of society in check. Women have the power to say no. Men, in most cases, don't. Sure, there's some special men out there that take a vow to God. I get that. But in general, women were assigned to be the gatekeepers of morality in terms of controlling the sexual drive. And women now have voluntarily surrendered that responsibility, which has left our society in a chaotic mess. And so, what is the answer now? What is the answer? We have a bunch of women addicted to materialism and making sure that marriage means they're going to get paid, and a bunch of men addicted to porn. And the porn is easy and fast, but it also, it allows men to deal with this turbulent, you know, relationship issue of women that won't give them a chance. It's a sad time. We talk about freedom, liberty, when in fact nobody's free and nobody's liberated. We're all slaves in so many different ways, socially, culturally, familially, economically, in every which way. We think because we have our little electronic gizmos in our hands and we have instant access to communications that we're the most special people in the history of the world. When I would argue that we're the most enslaved people in the history of the world through usury and through technology that's actually growing way too fast for us to comprehend and be able to get a control of at this point in time. So, what do you do with all of this? I don't know. I have no idea. When a vow doesn't mean anything anymore, when a person can walk away from their responsibilities. And like I said, it's easy to walk away from a vow when that vow is not given to God, when a couple only gives it to each other. And I think the dead giveaway for Catholics is easy. The dead giveaway is when Catholics marry non-Catholics. I would sure love to see a study done on this. Because I got to be honest with you. I know, listen, I know many Catholics are broken. I know that there's many Catholic divorces out there of when Catholics marry other Catholics. But from my anecdotal experience, when Catholics marry non-Catholics, when Catholics marry Protestants, when Catholics marry Jews, when Catholics marry other people of other faiths, it's almost, I got to say, an 80% divorce rate. I'm estimating it. That's from my experience what I've seen. And the other 20% don't get divorced. They have to submit to the other person and effectively surrender their Catholicism in order to protect the marriage. That's what I've seen. And if religion isn't enough, all the different ethnicities that are intermixing causes a whole nother set of problems. I'm not against interracial marriage. I'm not. The church is okay with it, always has been. Catholics have gone all over the world and They've intermarried in every culture. We weren't again, the Anglo-Protestants that had a racial stereotype that pushed off indigenous people and didn't intermarry because they had a racial policy. Catholics intermixed wherever they went, right? Whether it was Canada, whether it was South America, Mexico, and in some ways you could argue they created a new race of people. The Anglos took on more racial policies, defined racial policies that segregated themselves. And so we get to a point now in history where, because of pluralism, because of this melting pot approach that I don't think anybody really saw originally. I mean, honestly, if you're coming from a war-torn nation or a poverty-ravaged nation and you're coming to America for economic opportunity, I get it. I understand why you're coming. America did give that at one time, without a doubt. But you got to wonder if our ancestors knew what their bloodline would become mixed in this destructive diversity with destructive moral principles that would consume their bloodlines and the destruction of their family line. Would they have come? Would they have come? I don't know. I mean, you can say, well, Frank, listen, they're having the same problems in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal. I get it. I know they are. But at least that's a byproduct of war. Liberalism forced down the throats of those nations. It wasn't the collapse of Catholic society or Catholic moral principles per se. Yes, we could talk about Vatican II and all that stuff. But the faith of Vatican II was sealed with the Allied victory of World War II. It cemented liberalism dominance all over the globe. Classical liberalism in the West and communism in the East. That's what we're all suffering from now. And Christendom was vanquished. Granted, much more subtly in the West, under the guise of religious liberty, but nonetheless, as we've seen, religious liberty has done its damage because it tinkered with truth. It tinkered with history. It tinkered with tradition. It tinkered with the 2,000-year analogy of the faith of what Christianity always was, and not a Christianity that is invented and concocted in the moment to generally appeal to our fallen nature under the guise of freedom and liberty. You understand where we're at here? Do you understand where we're at? So now we have the divorce rate that's continuing to multiply across family lines, friends, ancestral roots, and all that nature. And in many ways, a lot of these people are left alone. A lot of these people are less desperate, dealing with blended families, which is unnatural in some ways, and picking up the pieces of a broken culture that doesn't give marriage oftentimes a very good chance, just based on the religious and cultural anarchy of liberalism. And there's part of me that feels sorry. Well, that feels sorry for a lot of these people that maybe were seduced by our liberal society. Because listen, governments have control of the education system. And most of us have been shuffled into public schools. And all the problems that come with public schools. And when parents are both forced out of the house because two incomes are now necessary, guess who's raising the kids and guess whose values are going to be dominant? It's going to be your government. It's going to be your liberal culture. And when our fallen nature is enamored by our sexuality, which is something that starts at a very young age, and these kids begin to engage with one another, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, some people later on mature. Some people later on realize the mistakes they're made. They have an awakening. But in the midst of a liberal drenched society, sometimes that doesn't happen until you're 30 years old, 35, 40 years old. By that point, you formed many different relationships. And a lot of them are broken relationships. And how do you fix that? As Catholics, we have a strict standard of, you know, no divorce, no remarriage after divorce. I get that. But what if you're born in this liberal drenched society that, when you're 17, 18, 19 years old, seduces you into making, well, mistakes, especially when there's not a culture that supports the Catholic way of life. It's not a Catholic society. It's not a Catholic culture. It's a liberal culture. It's a secular culture. I know many of my Catholic friends say, Frank, you're making excuses here. You're making excuses. I'm just observing what's obvious. Not all of us are born and raised in super duper trad communities. And I get it. We have this super duper trad thing going on line for Catholics where they're super duper holy. They all have a dozen kids and, they go to their Latin, parish mass and all that stuff. And they're the most righteous people in the face of the planet. I get it. I understand that. But I came from a part of the country. We didn't have the Latin mass. We had Novus Ordo. And I came from a part of the country where it was, listen, it was homogenous Italian and Croatian, which were both Catholic and Hispanic, all Catholics. We all went to the same parish. And we saw it all collapse in front of our very eyes. All of it. The culture consumed all of it. Maybe again, super duper, trad parishes can protect Catholics in those areas a little better. But for those of us that even came from homogenous societies in a liberal culture, we saw it all collapse. I mean, with me, it hit directly because I wind up marrying a non-Italian woman, wonderful woman, love her to death. She's my soulmate. She's everything to me. Most wonderful woman I ever met. But what would have made more sense to me was if I would have married coming from a part of the country where there was lots of Italians, right? I would have married another Italian woman to keep the cultural hegemony along with the faith. The problem was that all the Italian women had lost their moral compass where I was from. No, and I mean all of them. I never knew an Italian girl my age that I went to school with that actually kept the faith. I didn't know one. Not one. And I wasn't going to marry outside the church. I wasn't going to marry for secular purposes. I was going to get married in the church. And what I saw was sons and daughters of Italians and Croatians, because where I came from, heavy Catholic Croatian population, they were all consumed by the culture. And most of them now have gone through one bad marriage after another, and their kids now are drowning in the moral cesspool of this liberal society. Everybody I knew was addicted to porn. Everybody I knew was having sex out of wedlock. Everybody I grew up with was enamored in materialism. Everybody I knew was enamored in what do you want to call it? Finding a status, becoming a status symbol in society. It was about the ways of the world, and the faith was all lost. And what's funny is most of these kids and their grandparents, at the very least, very religiously devout. Most of actually their parents were religious, devoutly Catholic. But as soon as they were thrown into the public sector, into the public school system, and everything that comes along with American society, the pop music and the cultural fads and the liberalism, it consumed all of it, man. It consumed everybody that I knew. And these kids start going around from one bad marriage to the next bad marriage because most of them don't even know how to form proper relationships. They don't even understand the sacramental nature of marriage, right? That was a time in the 80s. Oh, that marriage is just a piece of paper. Okay. Just a piece of paper. That's what you believe. It shows you how much somebody failed to articulate to you the ideas of what marriage actually is. And the society broke down. And as a result, all kinds of dysfunctional, broken marriages happen with broken offspring. Because the moment liberal society consumes a child, then all of its offsprings generally are consumed with it. The attitudes, the trends, they all change. The values of the old world, those Christian principles, they all evaporate. And now relationships are based upon human ideals, human drives, human principles, which all fail in the end. In the culture that I came from, in the part of Los Angeles I came from, that was basically sex and materialism. Those were the gods we all worshiped. And so how do we deal with this crisis? And then after you've been seduced by the culture at the age of 16, 17, 18, 19, mom and dad are not there for you. And yes, mom and dad are to blame for that to a certain degree, without a doubt. I'm not exonerating mom and dad. You find yourself in one with one sexual partner after another. You wind up finding somebody, get married, and you wind up getting divorced. And all of a sudden now you're like, okay, I'm 30 years old. I've kind of seen the light. I've made these mistakes. What is the answer the church gives me? I can't get remarried. I got kids, or if I don't have kids, I'm going to be alone the rest of my life because of the strict standard that Christ gave to us. It's a tough one. I'm not making excuses for it because I live by it. I believe in it. But I know many young men that have been seduced by young ladies who play the game to get what they wanted and then abandon these young men only to be left alone and to say now, suffer, suffer, suffer. Okay, I get it. It's just a hard one to swallow because the entire culture is broken. There's no cultural reinforcement of what is right. Before feminism, before liberalism, young women could not just up and leave a marriage whenever they wanted. I'm sure some did, but there was social stigmas. There was religious stigmas. There was governmental stigmas that put, again, social constructs in place so that these marriages simply cannot be abandoned willy-nilly based upon our fallen passions or our fallen emotions. There were things like shame and blame. There was familial pressures, right? Because oftentimes marriages were not just love at first sight. I'm going to the club. Ooh, I got to hit that booty or whatever it is. She's cute and you get married one day, right? No, marriages were formed in different ways. A lot of them were familial alliances. A lot of them were just families getting together, looking for good prospects for their offspring. Families were involved, but we don't have families anymore. We've destroyed the family now. We're a bunch of radical individuals left to the whims and the drives of a liberal society with all of its moral depravity. And do we expect people not to make mistakes and to fall hard? Look around. Look around at the culture that we have. From the drugs to the sex to the music to the movies, the pornography, the materialism, the narcissism, the politics of the system, it's all corrupt. It's all broken. And all I'm saying here is I'm not making excuses. All I'm saying is I feel bad for a lot of people that are in this situation that maybe got caught up in a relationship that was disordered from the very beginning. And again, from my experience, knowing lots of Catholics, that great disorder usually happened when Catholics married non-Catholics. And even worse, when they were shacking up out of wedlock to begin with, and when they were having kids out of wedlock to begin with. That marriage was completely disordered from the very beginning. So I guess the point of it all is my advice: keep the faith. Practice the faith of your ancestors, of your parents and your grandparents. Don't shack up out of wedlock. Get to the sacraments. Marry other Catholics that believe in the faith. You want a general rule to protect yourself? If you're doing it different than how your grandparents did it, you're probably doing it wrong. Let's be honest. We look at tradition as some old fogey ideas to protect us, from having fun. No. Traditions are handed down by our ancestors to protect us because they've lived in this world and nothing really ever changes. Traditions are established through experience. Traditions are established through trial and error. Traditions are our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents handing down words of wisdom, ideas, principles of wisdom to protect us today. If you did it different than your grandmother did it, you're probably doing it wrong. Did grandma shack up out of wedlock? No. Did grandma have kids out of wedlock? No. Did grandma have sex before marriage? No. Did grandma do a shotgun wedding in Vegas with the freaking Elvis being the pastor or presiding over the wedding? No. Grandma did it by honoring God. Grandma did it, at least from my experience, because she was a devout Catholic and she practiced the faith. If you're doing it different than grandma, you're most likely doing it wrong. And those traditions were handed down by our grandparents and great-grandparents to protect us today. They're words of great wisdom that should be cherished and not dismissed. It's our liberal society that tells you we have to dismiss tradition. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. This liberal society has fallen. And there's no phony chance of freedom and liberty that's going to change my mind that this world somehow is better than the world of the past, where it was much more morally sound, culturally sound, and in some ways more politically sound. The liberalism of the West has led into a chaotic cluster fart of a disaster at this point in history. I want to thank you for joining me once again, volume 23 of the Integralist Chronicles. This is Frank signing off, frankly speaking. Good night, everybody.